Subscribe to The Honest Critique for current affairs, movie, book, and product reviews. Also, make sure you press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video. The views, information, or opinions expressed during the video series are solely those of the individuals and do not necessarily represent those of The Honest Critique and its employees. The following video contains strong language which may be offensive to some viewers. Viewer discretion advised.
So, hello and welcome to another episode of Security, Intelligence and Terrorism series. And today we have Ambassador Chris Alexander with us. For 18 years, he served as a Canadian diplomat serving in the Canadian Embassy in Moscow under Yeltsin and Putin. From 2003 until 2009, he was the first resident Canadian ambassador to Afghanistan and deputy special representative of the Secretary General for Afghanistan. In 2011, he published The Long Way Back, Afghanistan's Quest for Peace. He was the MP from 2011 to 2015, serving as Parliamentary Secretary for National Defence in Canada's Ministry of Citizenship and Immigration. Thank you so much, sir, for taking your time and being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Okay. So thank you, sir, for joining us today. Before we begin with the questions, I'll quickly give a brief background about what we are going to discuss and what is happening as we speak. So United States has decided to withdraw its troops from Afghanistan, and the deadline has been set to 11th of September 2021. While the negotiations are happening in Doha with at a very slow pace, attacks have been at the highest level. Civilian population have been targeted. There are unclaimed attacks from various factions within the Taliban. They have been very ruthless in the military campaign, as well as the ISKP, the Islamic State Khorasan province, has been occupying a lot of footage in the whole scenario. So starting with the first question, so you started your journey in Afghanistan back in 2003 when the war was not yet started, or we can say it was very much controlled. And you saw the war broke out, the Taliban regroup and start attacking the American forces, the Resolute Support, the ISAF, and the UNAMA, every other foreign participant in the whole theater. So let's start by discussing one of the most recent developments in Afghanistan, the US troop pullout. Many experts have maintained that a non-condition-based withdrawal will further push Afghanistan at the brink of civil war. The Biden administration tends to disagree. What, in your opinion, could be the consequences of such a pullout? Will the Afghan National Army and the regional forces counter the threats without any international support? How capable will they be?
Well, I think without any international support, they would have a very tough time, that's for sure. But we need to distinguish between the withdrawal that's underway now and the continuing partnership that NATO, the United States, and other allies have committed to supporting for many years to come. Keep in mind as well that since 2014, the Afghan National Army, NDS, Afghan National Police have been conducting, have taken the lead and have been delivering combat operations almost on their own for these last 6 years. And they have prevented the Taliban from taking district capitals, from taking provincial capitals. There are these numbers out there about the Taliban controlling 50% or 60% of the territory, but most of this territory that appears on such pessimistic maps is unpopulated, is unirrigated, and is not where anyone plans to live. The population centers are still very much in the hands of the government, and that defense, that protection has been ensured by Afghan forces for 6 years. So the key is, what international enablers will remain? The Biden administration has continued to talk about a counterterrorism capability for Afghanistan. We're not entirely sure how that's going to be delivered. There's a question of air power. There is an Afghan Air Force, which is doing serious damage to the Taliban and other Pakistani proxies in recent years, in recent months. But will US air power still be available to the Afghan National Army as it has been for the last 20 years? We'll have to see about that. I think the signs are good, but there's a question. on that front. And so looking ahead, what will happen? Think of the withdrawal of Soviet forces in 1988. It did not lead to really any serious threat to the Najibullah regime for 3 years, up to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when all effective support from Moscow ended. And that's what brought down the Najibullah regime. I think in Afghanistan's case, a lot of international support is going to continue. You're not going to see that collapse or disappear anytime soon. And so the prospects for Afghan national security forces to keep delivering the kind of result that we've seen for the last 6 years are quite good, I think. That said, it's going to be bloody. There's going to be escalation. I think the Taliban are holding a part of their punch in reserve, and hoping to inflict it the day after the last U.S. troops are gone. And then we'll be into uncharted waters. I think a lot depends here on what political moves Afghanistan's partners are prepared to make to end this war, because obviously the peace process, as we've seen it up until now, is going nowhere.
Okay. So, talking about the regional actors such as Pakistan, Russia, China, Iran, and India, especially none of these countries, for example, India and Pakistan, share a common consensus when it comes to Afghanistan. These nations instead build a different consensus over Afghanistan. So how does that affect the regional dynamics in and around Afghanistan?
Interesting. Very interesting question. I mean, one of the only areas of consensus for the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, the 6 countries that have land borders with Afghanistan, was that all of them, to one extent or another, wanted U.S. forces to be gone from Afghanistan. That was a unifying objective, if you will. But with the departure of U.S. forces, as you say, the consensus breaks down very quickly. I would say out of the 6 countries, and let's add in India as a 7th, the vast majority, almost all, are opposed to a military takeover by the Taliban and a new period of emirate similar to the 1996-2001 period. Even Pakistan's military leaders, General Bajwa, is on record publicly saying that he and his colleagues do not welcome a Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. At the same time, there are at least 2 countries that are neighbors of Afghanistan that are so concerned about having influence in Kabul that they're prepared to back armed proxies at the moment on a significant scale. Pakistan is obviously number 1. Iran also has armed proxies to some extent, including elements of the Taliban that are commanded and controlled from and funded from Iran and not Pakistan. So the real question is, what will be the direction, the trajectory of Pakistan and Iran's proxy involvement in Afghanistan after July, and as this peace process reaches a kind of culmination? The expanded troika and the 6 neighbors have all agreed that there needs to be a ceasefire and a peace agreement, that no party, no country, and no proxy should be allowed to fight its way to power in Kabul. Well, that has not been achieved up until now. And if it's not achieved in the current format, then the question will be, is Moscow, is Beijing, is the European Union, and are the United States, as well as other players, including quite crucially India, are they prepared to do something about those countries that are still trying to fight their way to power in Kabul? And that really means doing something about Pakistan, because the elephant in the room here is the fact that this proxy war on the part of Pakistan's military and security agencies is nothing new. It's been going on for 43 years in one form or another. Yes, it was co-sponsored by the United States for part of that time. Yes, it stopped for a short period after 9/11, but it's been pretty hot and heavy for the last 20 years. And now it's obvious to everyone that there's really only one major sponsor of proxy war in Afghanistan, and that is Pakistan. And so the question will be, what are the other 5 neighbors willing to do if one of the 6 is really breaking every commitment that has been made by the international sponsors of the peace process? And I think that is a political tension that we're going to see building over the summer and the fall.
On that note, post what we might see after the US withdrawal, do you think a common consensus that still existed with the US presence, with a lot of countries working for cooperation, might also destabilize?
Listen, I think there is still hope for, I almost called it a dream, but let's call it the vision, the concept of an Afghanistan that is at peace and that is a bridge between some of the principal regions of Asia. Let's be honest. Afghanistan, since its creation in its modern form, with its modern borders, mostly by British diplomats operating with the Shah of Iran on the one hand, with the emirs of Afghanistan on the other hand, and with the Tsars of Russia, these borders were carved out to form what all the neighbors, Persia back in the 19th century, Russia, and British India, considered to be a buffer state. And a buffer state was, had something less than full status, full privileges and immunities under international law. For a period, it didn't have control over its own foreign policy. And it was invaded by regular forces or irregular, by directly or by proxy, repeatedly, because there was this unspoken and sometimes formalized agreement that Afghanistan was a buffer state. That status continued into the 20th century to the extent that Pakistan continued its policy of strategic depth. The United States, or the Soviet Union, invaded when it didn't like what it saw happening in Kabul. The United States responded with irregular war. Afghanistan through the 20th century was treated as a buffer state. The issue today is, are we prepared, not you and I, but are we, the international community, prepared to stand up for the rights of a state like Afghanistan to have the full characteristics and rights of sovereignty that countries like India and Canada, Russia, the United States have had for centuries? And it's very simple at this point. Are we prepared to allow one of the neighbors to continue interfering in Afghanistan on a grand scale? I think the answer is increasingly no. I think the fight today and the political challenge today is to ensure that the buffer states, the sort of lower status sovereignties of the 19th and indeed the 20th century are respected the same way more historical democracies and other states have been able to protect their borders over the longer term. And that's why there's so much attention today on Ukraine. You and I see Ukraine as a sovereign state with borders recognized. Russia does not see them that way. Similarly, Israel. Let's not get into borders and all the long history of the Israeli-Arab conflict, but this is basically an issue of whether Israel has the right to exist, or whether Iran has the right to continue proxy wars on a quite grand scale from Lebanon, from Gaza, and from elsewhere that aim at the elimination of Israel from the map. Similarly, Afghanistan, it's not going to go anywhere as a country. It's too big and too historical for anyone to call that into question. But does it have the right to inviolable borders? Does it have the right to not be interfered in by irregular forces that come across those borders? You and I would agree, yes. Obviously, there's a very different perspective in General Headquarters in Rawalpindi. And this discussion is really about whether the international community is prepared to act politically to uphold the sovereign rights and the principles of international law to which Afghanistan should have full access to stop interference by one country in particular. And there's a deeper habit of interference in Afghanistan that involves the British, the Russians, the Iranians, that also must be broken if Afghanistan is to be truly stable.
Well, very well, sir. Very well said. And indeed, much of the roots of this conflict lie in the background, especially as far as when you describe the whole part and element of the British Raj and the British diplomats, trying to figure out the borders between Afghanistan and the British India, especially the 2,670 kilometer long Durand line. That is also one of the roots of these proxy wars in Afghanistan. So moving ahead with that, sir, what also has been observed in the past is that the Doha office of the Taliban has a very little control over the ground commanders. The regional district commanders or the shadow officials of the Taliban, the shadow governors of the Taliban, reject any peace deal with Kabul administration or the United States. So what does it say about Taliban as an Islamic emirate? Is it a one whole group or is it a broken fraction? Is it a monolith or is it an element just used as a tool by an external factor?
I think there are a lot of fault lines inside the Taliban. Some are regional, some are based on funding. There are differences between those whose money has come from Pakistan, whose money has come principally from the drug trade, whose money has come principally from Iran. And there are different generations of Taliban. Many of the older generation really did want to put the conflict to one side and reconcile. And they've tried, particularly over the last 10 years, to do that. But those that have made those overtures have tended to end up in jail or assassinated. They've been taken off the field of battle because the one unifying force for the Taliban has not wanted them to succeed. And that unifying force, obviously, is the let's call it the irregular warfare management structure of Pakistan's military, which isn't just run out of ISI, as we all know. It's also other branches of military intelligence. It's the Intelligence Bureau at times. It's branches of the Frontier Corps. It's a very elaborate organization, but it is the unifying factor for the Taliban. And the group that sits in Doha and talks to Khalilzad or whoever, they are not calling the shots. They are absolutely secondary. And even the Taliban commanders who are militarily most significant, a couple of whom were in Guantanamo but are now in prominent positions in the shuras, the military shuras that oversee Taliban operations, several of whom are part of the Haqqani group, which is sort of the Hizb Islami of this period, the chosen subgroup of the Taliban that are favored by Islamabad and Rawalpindi because they are more ruthless and more strategically minded than other fractions of the Taliban. They're the ones calling the shots. They don't go to Doha. In most cases, they still face international sanctions potentially. They have a lot of Afghan, American, and NATO blood on their hands, and that's not going to change. But even they are not calling the shots. I've interviewed dozens of Taliban commanders and read even more accounts of how they operate, they don't sit in their own command structure and decide how they're going to launch this June's campaign in Afghanistan. They sit in rooms with a Pakistani major, a Pakistani lieutenant colonel, a Pakistani brigadier, and they take their orders from GHQ effectively. And those orders are given, they're not up for discussion. They're to be implemented, and they reflect the full spectrum of enablers that Pakistan is providing to keep the Taliban in the fight and in the game. So will there be a breakthrough with the Taliban at Doha? No. The real discussion will be between the United States and, I hope, eventually between the international community and on one hand, and Pakistan as the principal sponsor of proxy war in Afghanistan on the other hand. That should have been the discussion from the beginning. There also needs to be a settlement of outstanding political issues between Kabul and Islamabad. I mean, as any Indian knows, there is a long legacy of unfinished business there that goes back to 1947 and even before. The border hasn't been recognized. Basic terms of the bilateral relationship haven't been formalized. And there is, I think, a legitimate concern on the part of Pakistan that some in Afghanistan don't just want to achieve stability for their country. They want to bring about the dissolution and the breakup of Pakistan, which no one in the international community is going to espouse as a goal, because the goal should be to bring peace between the two countries. But there's a deeper issue here of Baloch nationalism, Pashtun nationalism, the way in which Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan were incorporated into Pakistan in 1947 and the years after. That also needs to be discussed and settled. And we need to be very clear, I think, as representatives of the international community, that we are not embracing a separatist agenda either for Afghanistan or Pakistan. We are trying to bring about conditions that will ensure peace in Afghanistan first and foremost, but also in Pakistan. And here there are dynamics at work inside Pakistan that are important. Some movements in Balochistan and elsewhere have turned to violence, but they remain relatively small. The violence has been greater, I think, in previous decades and previous eras. One movement that has achieved a lot of traction without achieving much international notoriety is the Pashtun protection movement. And Manzoor Pashtun and the MNAs that are associated with that movement, they really show the extent to which not just Afghans, Pakistanis, and particularly residents of the former Fatah, are war-weary and eager to embrace peace and throw off the legacy of proxy war.
Well, yes, that's absolutely right, sir. That how Baloch nationalism and the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement has taken a lot of momentum, and a lot of leaders of the whole movement, such as Manzoor Pashtun and Ali Wazir, they have gained a lot of international attraction towards their movement. We have certain questions on that, and also I was reading your paper last night, the 50-page paper that you drafted, ending the proxy war in Afghanistan. Ending the Pakistan proxy war in Afghanistan. And what I came across is that there has been a lot of moving actors in the whole region. And one thing I couldn't gather is, what is this bone of contention that is stopping Kabul administration and the GHQ Rawalpindi to break a dialogue, to make a breakthrough in conversations?
Great question. I mean, when you drill down with Pakistani generals and their supporters, the voices that speak up for them, you eventually come down to these issues of fear of Pashtun nationalism and sometimes Baloch nationalism. That's one. Anxiety over an unsettled border. The fact that it is still political suicide in Afghanistan to say that the Durand Line is a border and not just a term of art. And thirdly, you find them saying, well, it's not really our decision to continue this proxy war to support the Taliban. This is something we've been doing since the 1980s with American backing, and we still have implicit American backing. So call that the Brzezinski doctrine. I mean, I call it in the paper, I refer back to this term positive symmetry. The idea, which is essentially a modern euphemism, diplomatic term of art for renewing Afghanistan's status as a buffer state. I mean, positive symmetry, as you both will recall, was this principle laid down by Secretary of State Christopher in Geneva at the conclusion of those talks that led to the Soviet withdrawal in 1988-89. The Soviets under Shevardnadze had expected that with their withdrawal, all support, international support for proxies in Afghanistan would end. But the United States, under pressure from Pakistan at that time, realized that this would mean ending the fight under Hizb Islami principally, but other forces as well, to get rid of Najibullah. And it would, negative symmetry in 1988-89 would have guaranteed Najibullah a long life. No one at that time foresaw that the Soviet Union was going to break up. So the US, again, under strong Pakistani pressure, we don't know exactly what was going on in the back rooms, but some of the protagonists are still around and could tell us. They said, no negative symmetry. We want your troops out. We won't have US troops there, obviously, but the subsidies can continue. So positive symmetry was embraced, which meant the Soviet Union, can keep subsidizing Najibullah and his army. We Americans, and above all, we Pakistan, because the US was withdrawing from the region and cutting its subsidies, we will continue supporting our mujahideen. And even today, Pakistani policymakers will say, we still have implicit support for the Taliban. They are referring back to 1989, basically. And no one in the United States has formally renounced this idea of positive symmetry. In other words, the buffer status of Afghanistan is still very much a reality and alive for Pakistanis, and it hasn't been sufficiently discredited or renounced by others in the international community, especially the United States. So I think that's the issue that needs to be attacked. There is no international support for what Pakistan is doing. There has been naivety on the part of the international community, yes. There has been pragmatism on the part of the international community, definitely. But there is no basis in law, in treaty, or in any past agreements for the proxy war that is now going on, and that needs to be pointed out. And as I argue in my paper, I think we should also ask the United States and support the United States in formally renouncing this principle of positive symmetry. This is not something that any other country in the world would accept. Basically the right of neighbors to continue proxy wars on its territory. That's, India doesn't accept it in Kashmir. Israel doesn't accept it on its territory. Russia would obviously never accept it, and no sovereign nation, and especially no democracy, would ever accept it. So this is the crux of the political issue that we're just starting to confront as people realize that the Taliban is not an autonomous force, that they are not some group of romantic freedom fighters, as some have tended to think, inspired by Che Guevara or the North Vietnamese or whatever. They are just a vicious proxy arm of an army that specializes in irregular warfare, and that's the Pakistani army.
Yeah. So in the same paper, you've also mentioned Pakistan as the chief spoiler, and in the whole theater, it has been claiming to act as a peace builder by bringing the Taliban on the negotiating table. So what does it say about the nature of Pakistan as a nation state, and what is it actually trying to do?
Well, I think there's a lot of desperation on the part of Pakistanis right now to somehow have a breakthrough and be respected again on the international stage. They read the numbers, above all the economic numbers, the development indicators, all of which are not happy reading for anyone in Pakistan today. I mean, the ministers of Imran Khan's governments put a brave face on it, but I put some of these figures in the paper. Pakistan used to be the most prosperous on a per capita basis country, arguably, in South Asia. Through much of the 20th century, one could have argued that and had statistics to back the claim. In the last 20 years, as India has made significant reforms, opened itself to the world, resolved many of its bilateral issues that had held back progress in the past. Since 2000, Indian per capita GDP has quadrupled. In Pakistan, per capita GDP has barely doubled. And so Pakistan is not only now behind India, both in terms of size and per capita wealth, it is also behind in terms of the speed and momentum of its development. And its debt load, for example, is very significant. Education has moved forward very quickly, has always been strong in India, but has advanced very quickly in the past 20 years. In Pakistan, it's arguably gone down. The enrollment level of young people, especially in rural Pakistan, especially in Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, is in question and has, in many cases, fallen back. Hence, we have an iconic figure such as Malala, who basically embodies the cause of a new generation who are not getting opportunities. Why? Because of proxy war. In her case, it is literally because of the Taliban that are proxy agents of the Pakistani government. Now, she doesn't come out and say that because she's already had a near-death experience at their hands and doesn't need other ones. But she comes as close as one can inside Pakistan today to acknowledging the truth. And the truth is that Pakistan is falling behind by almost every by almost every indicator. So what are they trying to achieve? They are doing what they've always done in the hope that suddenly they will have a president and a government in Kabul that they will be able to say shows they are a regional power on a larger scale. And they think that this is what they had for 5 years from 1996 to 2001, when indeed there was a Taliban regime in Afghanistan. In fact, that regime didn't last for very long. It was never consolidated. It was always contested by the Afghan resistance, mostly in the north of the country, but really in all parts of the country. And those in Pakistan's army tend to see those years, the late 90s, this is the Hamid Gul view of the world, as a high point for Pakistan. In fact, that was the beginning of Pakistan's decline that has accelerated in the 21st century. And the idea that would be repeated now, I think, is more or less absurd, because even with no US troops in Afghanistan, Afghanistan has much more profile, much deeper partnerships with the entire world than it had in 1996 or 2001. So what are they trying to achieve in Afghanistan? They're trying to break out from a position of strategic weakness. Do they have any chance of succeeding? I don't think so. I think they are themselves the greatest, and I'm talking here about the strategic thinkers at GHQ and ISI and so forth. They are themselves the greatest victims of a strategic illusion that is costing Pakistan enormously. Pakistan has enormous potential to move ahead economically, but only if it achieves security with its neighbors. Ultimately with India, that has to happen one day. But as we all know, Pakistan has a much longer border and a much more active war with Afghanistan.
A small follow-up on that, since you're mentioning about the economic stability that Pakistan also needs to achieve. So a few days back, we were talking to the National Security Advisor, former National Security Advisor to India, and he was also mentioning things when I asked him about Pakistan and why Pakistan has suddenly said about they started agreeing to the ceasefire agreement and affirmed that they will agree to it and they will make sure that they follow it up. He mentioned this interesting fact, and I want to also ask you for the same, that Pakistan only talks to India when it's either pressurized from the international community or has its own interests secured. So, with US leaving and especially using Pakistan for a face saver, do you think Pakistan interests are well settled in Afghanistan for Pakistan to come and negotiate with India or talk to India at the moment?
I don't think there's much prospect with the current hybrid regime in Islamabad and Rawalpindi of a historic breakthrough either in relations with India or Afghanistan. I think we have some distance to go before that is even a prospect. Let's be honest, Imran Khan has no say in any of this. I mean, he is pro-Taliban, basically, but he has nothing to say about military operations either on the Eastern Front in Kashmir or elsewhere, or on the Western Front, which I think is the most important front for the Pakistani army. I tend to see the few steps towards rapprochement that Bajwa has made with India as a way of covering his flank while he concentrates on Afghanistan. I think that's what he's doing with talking about a turn away from geopolitics to geoeconomics. That is not happening in Pakistan, but he is talking about it as a way to flash a shiny object at Delhi, get up the hopes of some people in Washington, in Europe, and in South Asia, while he goes in for the kill, what he thinks and hopes will be the kill in Afghanistan. But let's be clear, there have been 4 chiefs of the army staff since 9/11 in Pakistan who have overseen this proxy war in Afghanistan. Musharraf, who is quite ruthless and obviously politically canny, Kayani, Rahil Sharif, and now Bajwa. Of those 4, who are the real strategic architects of this policy? Musharraf was in it for himself. I don't think he had any grand designs in Afghanistan. At one point, he was actually skeptical of the Taliban as an ally or as a tool of Pakistan. He reversed that subsequently. The real architect of this policy is Ashraf Kayani. He was the strategic. If there is a genius who carried out this proxy war, an evil genius, I would argue, got away with it, managed to throw enough sand in the eyes of Americans and others to not be held to account, it was Kayani. Rahil Sharif continued that legacy. Bajwa is not the architect of it. And I don't think he has the level of conviction or the strategic breadth of vision to actually make a breakthrough. He is doing this because he is a disciple, to some extent, of Kayani's. And because they've gotten away with it so far. Why wouldn't they continue it and try to see it through? But I think there's the quality of Pakistan's effort, the sophistication of the disinformation and so forth has fallen down greatly in recent years. And there's another factor here. Pakistan used to be able to play very successfully on a strategic ambiguity between China and the United States. That worked quite well so long as China's reputation in the world was generally high. Even 2 years ago in India, China's reputation was much higher. In Canada, it was much higher. Now, China's reputation, mostly because of confrontation with India, but also because of events in Hong Kong and Eastern Turkestan and so forth, China's reputation has plummeted. And so it's no longer possible for Pakistan to play off this strategic ambiguity between the United States and China. And I think that's a very uncomfortable place for General Bajwa. It means he is not particularly popular in his own country. It means his hand as inside the puppet of Imran Khan is much more visible than ever before. He's on the hook for failures, everything from power failures to insufficient funds for education. And I think later this year, there are going to be further reckonings ahead because Pakistan is much more isolated than people realize. And this is a crucial point. Most Pakistanis do not know that this proxy war is going on. They do not know what has been done in their names. I mean, if one writes about it in Pakistan, one meets a sticky end. So it is not, I mean, I think people generally understand, particularly Pashtuns, particularly people in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, what's going on. But the scale of it is sort of a dirty secret for Pakistan. And as it starts to come out, as the story starts to unravel, it's going to increase Pakistan's isolation, make Bajwa and company even more appear to be even more mavericks and discredit them in various ways, and it is going to make them unpopular in the eyes of Pakistanis, who really are desperate not to see their economic decline, their economic retrogression continue.
Yes, very well reflected, especially the part where you mentioned about the evil geniuses. And I think the whole brass of evil geniuses in Pakistan starts from the very time of Ziaul Haq, and then followed by General Hamid Gul, General Rahil Sharif. And I'm glad that you left on a positive note that General Bajwa lacks that strategic depth and vision, which is actually a very good news for India. So,
well, I don't know him personally. I mean, he studied here in Canada for a year, as he studied in the United States. I don't think I've ever had any contact with him. But let's just, as a way of framing this issue, and I don't want to interrupt your question, Siddhant, but think back to General Bajwa's last visit to Kabul. We don't have the transcript of what was said. I can well imagine what the conversations were like with Ashraf Ghani, with Dr. Abdullah, and so forth. But we do have a couple of the public statements by Bajwa, and including one quote very deliberately given by President Ghani to Der Spiegel, this German magazine, about what Bajwa had told him. And he said, Ghani says that Bajwa told him he very much wanted to see peace in Afghanistan. He wanted the Taliban to enter a power sharing agreement, but some of the younger officers in his service were not on side with this idea, and hence the continuation of violence and the difficulty of achieving an agreement in Doha. I mean, can you imagine a 4-star general, an army staff chief in any country, blaming the
subordinates, the juniors,
the failure to end a proxy war on subordinates? I mean, that is a sign of weakness. and it's a sign of lack of conviction. Obviously, he didn't say it himself on camera. It was said to Ashraf Ghani and then relayed to the rest of us. But I think it's a kind of it's emblematic of where Pakistani strategic thinking is. Some of them are giddy with enthusiasm that victory in Kabul is just around the corner. The U.S. is about to leave. Let's put those people to one side. They are not realistic. They haven't understood the real situation in Afghanistan very clearly. In the more the better informed circles of decision making in Islamabad and Rawalpindi, I think there is a kind of strategic paralysis. They're doing what they have always done. They're looking for opportunities, but they actually don't know where they're going, and they don't know what the off-ramp is.
Very well, right, sir. Right, and I think this is not the very first time such a case within the Pakistan command structure has occurred. I remember reading the case of General Asad Durrani, the former DG ISI, that he, post his retirement, has been facing a lot of internal sanctions within the whole country. Like, he is not allowed to go outside, he's not even allowed to travel to Nepal or Afghanistan for that matter. And because of his disagreements with his subordinates and seniors and juniors when he was the DG ISI and after his retirement as well. So moving on, so you have very vividly mentioned about Directorate S, something which Steve Cole has written a book upon, which is right behind me, and which is a clandestine department under the ISI, which controls the proxies on the Indian front, in Kashmir, and the Afghan front. So could you give us a clearer idea about this clandestine unit of Pakistan intelligence in terms of its operation structure and hierarchy or anything as such?
Sure. Well, obviously, these are covert structures, so we can't get today's organizational diagram off the shelf or off the internet. But they are under more scrutiny than ever, and there are a number of books now that lay out, roughly speaking, the shape, doctrine, institutional structure, and operational reality of Directorate S and other parts of the ISI. And I think the best way to put it is this. They are, one, the principal delivery mechanism for irregular warfare, which is the principal operational focus of GHQ Pakistan at the moment. Secondly, they are, yes, a hierarchy of military officers controlling proxy forces, irregular forces that operate principally in Afghanistan, but they are enabled and supported by a much larger network of ISI and other Pakistani state and non-state institutions that give operational life, institutional life to the Taliban and other groups. So they are, when there is operational support or exchange between Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Taliban, that happens through Directorate S, obviously. When new groups are created, such as the Islamic State in Khorasan province, or groups are reflagged under different names and then given a role either as tactical rivals or as tactical allies to existing proxies, that happens through Directorate S. But the final point, so it's embedded in a much larger network of support. That's the second point. Thirdly, though, we have to see Directorate S basically as an umbrella for the whole proxy war. And when people say, well, where is this Directorate S? We haven't, how did we miss it? Why aren't there articles in the New York Times about it? Well, obviously no one, literally no one from a NATO country or from a news organization, a democracy, has been invited into the command center of Directorate S. That's just not going to happen. One of their objectives is disinformation, propaganda, and indeed active measures to make sure that their role is not revealed, that a narrative is not established about how integral they are to the operations of the Taliban. And outside of that command center, they have all of these operational assets that are not identified as ISI or even as Pakistani state agencies. These are people operating in civilian clothes, in shalwar kameez, in Balochistan, in and around Quetta, in the old Fatah, all over Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Some are providing housing for Taliban leaders and other fighters. Some are providing food. Some are looking after families. Some are providing medical support. Others are engaged in the harder end activities, such as operational training, such as intelligence, such as training ID teams, some of which are very sophisticated, assassination teams. It's a very large organization. It involves thousands of people, and it's very hard to establish where the Directorate S payroll ends and the Taliban payroll begins. And again, the Taliban payroll goes back to structures and organizations, donors, drug traders, and others who are all part of this larger network. So again, it's the elephant in the room. I think Steve Cole's book was important because it put the term out there. I think Carlotta Gaull's book, The Wrong War, was even more important. It came out earlier, and in a even more pointed way talked about Pakistan's role. There's at least one American intelligence expert who's written a book on the ISI and on Directorate S. I'm sure you can remember the name of the author. I can't at the moment. But this is increasingly out there in the open. And I think one of the keys to bringing peace to Afghanistan is to have it fully acknowledged, to have it fully documented, and to have people recognize that for the last 20 years, this has been a gap in public understanding of the conflict. And that gap needs to be filled urgently if we want to see peace in Afghanistan and the region.
Yeah. So, sir, a very little is known about the current status of the Haqqani network, and there were reports earlier as well that they have been tying up with the Al-Qaeda cell to carry out attacks, and the Quetta Shura as well, which is the governing council of the Taliban, and both the components are part of the Pakistan's proxies. So, according to your assessment, what are the current status of these two major elements?
Well, the Haqqani group has gone from being a kind of elite force within the proxy order of battle, which it was during my years in Afghanistan. By elite, I mean they were the ones given more resources, more training, and then entrusted with high-impact operations, such as the suicide bombing campaign. That came from the Haqqani network. Some of the main assassinations over the last 15 years have been carried out by them. They were seen as more trusted and more ruthless, and therefore had could call upon more resources, just as Hizb Islami became central to the effort in the 1980s because they were seen as more militarily proficient and indeed ruthless, including against civilians. But the Haqqani network has kind of graduated from that status around the time of the death of Mullah Omar, or maybe it's better to talk about the removal of Mullah Omar, because the exact date of his death is still debated, and
Unknown.
he was eased out and then died. Let's put it that way, because he was not seen as dynamic enough, probably wasn't in great health, and these guys coming back from Guantanamo, hardened, further indoctrinated, as well as the next generation in the Haqqani group, were seen as the more committed leaders. And so around that time, Omar leaves. Some of the Taliban commanders who had been in the fight from the beginning thought they were definitely in line to take over, including Mullah Baradar. But at the same time, they were in discussion with Kabul, the UN, the US, or all three. And Pakistan got wind of this and didn't want them anywhere near the leadership, military leadership of the proxy war. So they were given secondary rules, including rules in the discussion that now takes place in Doha. Over that period, the Haqqani group was given essentially leadership of the proxy war in Afghanistan. And some of their Jalaluddin and others, Sirajuddin, played those leadership roles in the last decade. Now, in particular, Siraj and his brothers are seen as having played the crucial role in the last 5 years.
And he also wrote a New York Times op-ed.
Well, this I think that moment represented the sort of maximum, let's call it peak US naivety. And I wouldn't say that those in positions of ultimate responsibility in Washington or Langley or the Pentagon ever fell for this level of naivety, but certainly the liberal majority in public opinion in the US really held out the hope that negotiations were going to work. And they thought if you give Siraj a op-ed in the New York Times, that you're on your way to getting him to sign off on a peace deal. They obviously didn't know Sirajuddin Haqqani very well. And I mean, this has played itself out. Siraj had an op-ed, but Manzoor Pashtun has also had an op-ed in the New York Times. So they have tried to balance things out, but I don't think there's been a public spelling out in the US yet of the shape this proxy war has taken. And that's going to be very important when it happens, because America's policy has definitely been incoherent. They haven't stepped away from what Pakistanis see as an implicit commitment to positive symmetry. Hamid Karzai said that the United States has effectively been backing both sides in the war for 20 years. I mean, that is a legitimate claim that one can make. And how much was out of naivety and how much was out of just incompetence, that will be debated, I think, for years to come. But here's where the chickens are coming home to roost. Sirajuddin Haqqani and company, because they were an elite force, were not just killing Afghans with abandon. They were killing Americans. They are responsible for the biggest assassination, the biggest operation that resulted in the death of CIA officers, I think, in the history of that agency. Many American special forces and American military assets were eliminated in suicide attacks or other complex attacks by the Haqqani group. And that has been noted and remembered. Moreover, the Haqqani group has always been associated with Al-Qaeda. I mean, Jalaluddin Haqqani, I think, was one of the first to swear bayat to Osama bin Laden to facilitate the launch of his organization after 1988, 89. And it's to anyone who's a real student of the region, it is no surprise that they are still operating hand in glove with today's Al-Qaeda. Ayman al-Zawahiri is still at large, presumably living in Pakistan. He hasn't sent me any postcards lately, but maybe you have got some. So the Haqqanis are, if you're going to have a list of terrorists in the world today, the Haqqanis must be on it. There is just no stepping away from that. And I think the UN, the updated UN report on the extent to which the Taliban and Al-Qaeda are still cooperating, still operating together, is a wake-up call for everyone, and should be a wake-up call to general headquarters that, yes, the US and its allies were prepared to see a certain number of Taliban fighters released in Kabul and elsewhere to bring the peace process to a conclusion. Yes, some Taliban leaders have been removed from the sanctions list as a way of lubricating the peace process. But the world is not prepared to forget about groups and individuals that have been considered a principal threat to international peace and security for 20 years and even longer, who are responsible for 9/11, who are responsible for countless attacks in Europe and elsewhere, and who are related to all the principal groups that mount attacks in India as well. So the reliance on the Haqqani group, and indeed on Al-Qaeda, continuing reliance, is going to be a liability for Pakistan's proxy war, not only for Directorate S, but for the whole military hierarchy.
True, that's very true. Two key figures that I really want to highlight and ask about is the first, the leader of Hizb Islami, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. So often it is said that he is considered as a soft Taliban in Kabul. And secondly, recently it was trending on Twitter. Where is Habibatullah, the Amirul Mominin, the commander of the faithful of the Taliban, Habibullah Akhundzada? So where is he? Is it a Mullah Omar 2.0 episode going on, or is he actually alive, or is he still in the command structure, or what is going on?
Yeah.
So yeah, something on
definitely
Gulbuddin and something on Akhundzada.
Well, starting with Akhundzada, I mean, he's clearly not ready for prime time, as they say in the United States. And whether he's in some perpetual ISI green room or being briefed for his first meeting with Ashraf Ghani, which is supposed to happen, I think it's irrelevant because, well, there's been talk of such a meeting happening if there was a peace process summit in Afghanistan. Whether this happens or not, I think is actually irrelevant because it draws attention to the fact that these people, whether they choose to glory in the name of Amir ul-Mominin or not, they are figureheads. They are not calling the operational shots. They have been chosen because they are safe, seen as safe by the brigadiers and generals who actually do call the shots. So I don't expect the current Amir ul-Mominin to play any significant role, and he may not even be seen as Mullah Omar was through most of his time as the ostensible leader of the Taliban. As for Hekmatyar, it's a very interesting question because I think there's a difference of opinion here. The Pakistanis see him literally as a stalking horse for the Taliban and a voice who can help them legitimize the Taliban's political role in Afghanistan. And perhaps he is to some extent. I mean, he has spoken up in recent weeks in favor of further concessions to the Taliban. And he wants the United States entirely out of the region, and no enablers left, and all of this. I mean, this is classic GHQ, or let's call it DGISPR talking points that he is loyally delivering on Tolo TV and elsewhere. But at the same time, look at it from an Afghan perspective. Afghans know, from Karzai and Ghani down through the ranks of the state agencies and through the political class, that Gulbuddin was left out of the equation for the last 20 years. He was not a happy guy living in Peshawar or wherever he was, because the hand that fed him moved on to feed others, the Haqqanis and so forth. And he was, let's call it, a disgruntled proxy. And now he's back in Kabul, living presumably a decent life. The Afghans see him as someone who is no longer prepared to be mistreated by the Pakistani state. Let's put it that way. And this is the weak point that all of the would-be reconciled Hizb Islami, Taliban, Haqqani, Al-Qaeda, other players have, they have lost respect. They have lost face in the eyes of most Afghans because they have made themselves agents of Pakistan in a proxy war, of a kind of neocolonialism that Afghans really don't like. There may be people who stand with the Taliban because they lost a brother in an American airstrike, or because a Shuri Nazar unit did something to their village or their family at some point in the past. And so they are allies of convenience with the Taliban. But there are almost no Afghans who are willing to proudly say, yes, we are the Taliban, our supporters are in Directorate S, and we're here to ensure Pakistan has political control of our country. You know, that bitter reality of this conflict is absolute anathema. It is the third rail, if you will, of Afghan politics. And indeed, it's a guarantee that people like Hekmatyar and indeed the few Taliban leaders who have reconciled and are now living in Kabul, it's a real limit on their appeal. And indeed, it's the skepticism about Pakistan's deeper agenda is shared by people like Hekmatyar as well. So these are things that are still playing out as a proxy war comes to be seen for what it is, and the real discussion about peace begins. I think Hekmatyar is an important player because he illustrates the limited popular and democratic appeal that any of these people will have. If they're, why are the Taliban and their GHQ backers afraid of a ceasefire? Well, because all of their leverage goes away as soon as there is a ceasefire. It's as simple as that. When the Taliban are living in peace, when Hizb Islami commanders are living in peace, they do not get elected. Just as over the last 20 years in Afghanistan, we did not see a lot of Jamiat, Junbush, Hizb Islami, or other Mujahideen commanders freely elected as representatives of the people. Yes, some of them managed to become governors, not through election, or to get into the parliament, but they are not high in popular ratings because people remember what they did. They remember the crimes and the violence of the Civil War period, especially, but also of the struggle led by the Mujahideen and everything that's come since the Taliban took power in Kabul and left power 5 years later in 2001. So the warrior class, the warlord class, has an interest in the war because that's their traction and their power. Peace, ceasefire is anathema to them, and this is perhaps, after Pakistan's role, the second biggest potential spoiler for the peace process. There is a large community on both sides, on the Afghan government side and on the Taliban proxy side, of vested interests, drug dealers, arms dealers, power brokers who don't want to see the conflict end because they will not survive the transition. And we outsiders who are trying to be a positive influence in bringing about peace, principally the United States, need to keep that in mind, that there are spoilers on both sides, even as the biggest spoiler is in GHQ.
Right. Very well said, sir. And if we talk about Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, and no wonder why is he not referred to as the butcher of Kabul, because he has been merciless throughout for his enemies and for his friends as well. So if we talk about the eastern front of Afghanistan, Konar has pockets of Lashkar-e-Toiba, Loya Patra has been a route for the Haqqani network to operate. Jaish-e-Mohammed has a very prominent presence in the eastern front as well, mostly in Nangarhar and Khost. So all these terrorist outfits are Pakistan-sponsored, and in some way we can also say that Pakistan created. Post the withdrawal, whom are the Afghan forces going to fight? The regional Taliban or these Pakistan regulars?
Well, I think they will respond to Pakistan's operational priorities. I mean, there was a big push by the Taliban into Helmand in the last month, and it was successfully pushed back by the Afghan National Army. Where will the next push come? We don't know. There are rumors that Zabul could be a priority. Ghazni could be a priority. We saw a sustained attack on Lagaman, which would have broken communications between Kabul and Jalalabad. So I think Afghan forces have no choice but to respond to the priorities set by their proxy war adversaries. The real question is, what is the end game for the proxy warriors if they cannot win even after a US withdrawal? I mean, their prestige up until now has rested on the fact that they're still in the fight, they're still going back every year, even though most of them get killed, against the greatest military power in the world. As of July 4th, it now looks, or even sooner, they won't be able to say that. And indeed, for the past 6 years, they haven't been able to, 7 years, they haven't been able to say that they were fighting American troops because that responsibility, combat responsibility, had been given fully to Afghans. So they've been losing when they claimed they would be winning. With no US troops on the ground, fighting on foreign territory, with growing numbers of Punjabis and Pakistani nationals in their ranks, not just as officers, but as rank and file, their credibility and their operational traction is actually going to decline. Now, I don't claim to have great first-hand operational insight into what's going on in every region of Afghanistan right now, but I would say generally the success and the military potential of the Taliban and their allies has been overstated, and the operational capacity and popular support enjoyed by Afghan security forces has been understated. And so the potential for a stalemate where most provincial capitals remain out of reach of the Taliban, most casualties continue to be on the Taliban side, is probably the scenario that is most likely at the moment.
So the Khorasan chapter of the Islamic State has also been a turning point in the Afghan war, and we have seen continuous targeted assassinations and attacks on religious minorities since its inception. So where do I find roots of the ISKP?
Well, when we talk about attacks on religious minorities, I mean, obviously the Hindu-Sikh minority in Kabul is one example. During the worst of the darkest hours of the Taliban regime, they had almost all left Afghanistan, but then came back in dribs and drabs after 2001. And then in the last year or two have faced renewed persecution, and some have had to leave. That's a kind of perennial story, unfortunately, in Afghan history. Afghanistan has done better when it has had stronger minorities, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh, and other. I mean, Qizilbash would count as one minority that is in a prominent position in Kabul and elsewhere. And then it has been on the back foot when those minorities have been under pressure and indeed persecuted. But the larger effort, I think, by Daesh and other groups that have this sectarian agenda, as you say, is directed against the largest Shia minority in Afghanistan, which is the Hazara group. And while it's debated who carried out this attack in Dashti Barshi and these continuing attacks on journalists and merchants and others who are prominent in the Hazara community, I don't think there's really any room for doubt, but that these groups are responsible. They may not claim responsibility. They may not put out press releases, the perpetrators of that 3-bomb attack in early May in Dashti-Barchi, Kabul, the center of the urban Hazara community, which has thrived in the last 20 years after the fall of the Taliban, broadly. The perpetrators may never be known, but there really is no other group in Afghanistan today that can carry out a complex IED attack with precise timing, large numbers of victims on the eve of a major celebration, other than Al-Qaeda, the Haqqani group, and Islamic State in Khorasan province. And I would, with near certainty, claim that the bomb maker and the other people involved were from those networks in one way or another. And it's been sustained. And I think the international response and the Afghan response need to take full account of the fact that the Hazara minority are bearing a disproportionate burden of the violence precisely because they are a religious minority, but also because of their ethnicity and the deeper roots of racism, discrimination, and violence as perpetrated against Hazaras over the longer term. I mean, think back to another proxy war. Well, not another proxy war, but another period of cross-border interference in Afghanistan that was sustained. I mean, probably the most sustained period was not the last couple of decades, but was under Emir Abdurrahman. I mean, a lot of people in Afghanistan revere him as someone who consolidated sovereignty, built some institutions, but he was also a British proxy. I mean, he was someone who was prepared to hand over, for the first time, responsibility for foreign policy to the British. And in return, he ruled for quite a long time and had a peaceful transition to his son, you know, all developments that are more or less without precedent in modern Afghanistan. But one of Abdurrahman's principal practices in terms of internal security was systematic repression of the Hazaras. And so this is something that has gone with foreign interference, that has gone with the consolidation of power favoring a foreign player for a very long time. And peace in Afghanistan has to be structured in a way that isn't anti-Pashtun. There is Pashtun discrimination in some circles as a reaction to the disproportionate persecution that minorities face and suspicion of Pashtuns that goes along with that, because many of those in Al-Qaeda, the Haqqani group, Islamic State of Khorasan province and others are Pashtuns, even though they've been indoctrinated and are essentially proxy servants of a foreign state. But when peace comes, there's going to have to be, and for peace to come, there's going to have to be a reckoning with these really severe forms of discrimination that still exist. And one is against Shia and Hazara minorities, but there are a whole host of others, which of course you know as well as I do.
That's right. I mean, the whole route can again be tracked back to Pakistan as a very various command chain of the Islamic State of Khorasan province, starting from Maulvi Aslam Farooqi in Pakistan to Abu Said Bajawuri in Pakistan and Hafiz Saeed, not to be confused with the Jamaat-ud-Dawa founder. So all these main command leaders of the ISKP have been from Pakistan. And so having said that, sir, if we talk about the command structure of the Taliban negotiating team. So the command structure of the Taliban negotiating team, starting from Sher Mohammad Stanigzai to freshers like Anas Haqqani, they have and of course not forgetting Mullah Brother. So they have very successfully managed to mainstream Taliban as a political movement rather than a dreaded militant group. And I was talking to someone in Kabul who was once associated with Sher Mohammad Stanigzai very closely, that he's a big fan of the Western culture. He likes to have expensive watches. He likes to wear Wayfarers, expensive sunglasses, and he's a very big fan of the Western Hollywood movies. So, all these features, they define these Taliban leaders on a very different personal way. However, the big picture seems to be very, very distinctive. So what does it say about the Taliban in terms of their long-term strategic gains, in terms of power sharing with the Kabul administration or overpowering Kabul administration?
Right. Well, ultimately, it's about power. They like this mainstreaming, as you describe it. They like this newfound supposed credibility that they have because it looks to them to be a pathway to power. But it will only represent power for them if certain conditions are in place. They will not do very well if there are free and fair elections in Afghanistan. They will not do very well if there is an early ceasefire in Afghanistan. They will not do very well if there is an independent media in Afghanistan. And this is why, and I think we need to understand this very clearly, those three issues that I've just mentioned, stand the way that they do. The negotiating team is really challenging the idea of a power sharing followed by elections because it's a threat to them. They are deeply skeptical and indeed successfully resisting the idea of a ceasefire because their negotiating power goes down as soon as that is in place. And thirdly, they're attacking journalists and well, in Pakistan as well, but with particular virulence in Afghanistan, especially women journalists, especially Hazaras, but especially, let's be honest, successful journalists, because light and truth and public scrutiny are again an enemy. I mean, their Achilles heel, these new Taliban leaders, particularly the ones that give themselves out as political faces of the Taliban today, is that to be a political force, you really need to have a political agenda. And they have no political agenda. They have nothing to offer the Afghan people. Their only political agenda is obtaining power and keeping it through violence and repression. And that is not going to be a very, ever a popular formula in any country, especially not Afghanistan, which is drunk so much from that cup in the last few decades.
So one small follow-up on that regarding the negotiations. We have seen a lot of back and forth. Sometimes there was a brief pause when there was a change in administration. A few days back, there was again a break for the holidays. But there's this constant thing that the violence has continued on ground, yet negotiations were on table. So how can these two go side by side with violence continues on ground and a lot of militants responsible for that and have targeted the Afghan National Security Force, not the NATO troops or the American troops out there? But violence continued and there's negotiation for peace.
Well, I think your question is very apt because it leads to exasperation on all sides. I mean, the Taliban have received almost all the concessions they've asked for, up to and including a full US withdrawal. But they have not delivered any of the items that were expected of them. The principal one being, of course, a ceasefire. So these lopsided negotiations, which I think were, from my perspective, were ill-conceived from the start, are going to be seen as unfair, unjust, and blocked, at an impasse by everyone who continues to look at them. And why are they blocked? Why are they at an impasse? Because the violence continues. Is it the negotiators at Doha that are responsible for that violence? No. I mean, General Bajwa has just been in Kabul blaming not Taliban commanders for the continuing violence, but his own junior officers. Well, there's only one way to respond to that kind of comment and to this sustained violence, and that is to have a more pointed discussion with General Bajwa. And I'm sure that is happening. I know that he was asked during his visit in Kabul about proxy war and when it would end and what he was doing to end it. Probably asked quite politely by the Afghans. My sense is that the U.S. is asking in less polite terms now, and U.S. priority obviously is on withdrawal of their troops. But if General Bajwa thinks that the U.S. is going to forget about its legacy in Afghanistan once those troops are gone, forget about the proxy war that continues to take thousands of lives, civilian lives, every year, forget about everything that has been invested in Afghanistan, not just by the United States, but by 70 plus countries, then he is kidding himself. And I think the U.S. ability to change course and be politically more demanding after its troops are gone will only increase, because they won't have to think in terms of force protection and logistics and supply lines and so forth. They will be thinking only in terms of the unfinished project of this peace negotiation. The U.S. is truly committed to a peace process that results in peace. The mistake has been to talk to people who don't matter, to talk directly to the Taliban without including the Afghan government, who are the only possible legitimate representatives of the Afghan people, and to not talk more openly at an earlier stage about GHQ's role. With U.S. troops gone, no ceasefire secured, the role of GHQ is going to come into a very uncomfortable focus, I think, all around the world. There will be nowhere to hide this reality anymore, even if there are fewer journalists than usual on the ground and so forth. This is such a naked and painful reality, the spoiler role of Pakistan's military, that it's going to command the attention of just about everyone. And I think the beginning of that reckoning will be this summer.
And that is because of the spring offensive?
No, I think it's because U.S. troops will be gone, and the fighting will continue, and the U.S. will have the latitude to be more honest with itself and with its allies about why the violence is continuing. It's not because Mullah Baradar hasn't given the order. It's because four-star generals haven't given the order.
Right. Yes, that's right. So now that we are towards the end of the interview, which is the best way to counter Pakistan proxy war in Afghanistan, and what is that one last thing that United States must do before leaving Afghanistan, if they leave Afghanistan?
Yeah, no, but let's be honest. The U.S. is not leaving Afghanistan as in,
exactly,
Saigon 1975. The commitment by the U.S., NATO, all allies, and all of Afghanistan's partners is long-term and substantive. But U.S. forces are leaving. What should the U.S. do as they leave? It should talk more openly with full-throated conviction about the reality of this proxy war and about Pakistan's role. I've heard U.S. policymakers like Admiral Mullen say very tough things in public about Haqqani, for example. Remember when he was leaving office, Admiral Mullen said how difficult his dialogue over many years had been with Haqqani, and he said the Haqqani group operates as a veritable arm of the Pakistani state or of the ISI. I can't remember his exact form of words. The trouble with that statement is that he made it as he was leaving office. What I'm waiting for, and I think what Afghans are waiting for, and what would be enormously beneficial to the United States itself, not to mention for the region and the broader world, is for a U.S. office holder to come into his or her responsibilities saying the main obstacle to peace in Afghanistan is this proxy war. Our job, our goal is to ensure it ends. And so I think that's job one for the US. It is to tell the truth about this this conflict. The US has been one of the only countries in the world with different levels of conviction at different times talking about Iran's proxy wars, not just in Iraq and Syria, but also in Gaza and Lebanon and Yemen and other countries. I think most of the world acknowledges that that is a reality now, and most of the world has designated and considers many of these groups active in those wars, from the Revolutionary Guards to Hezbollah and Hamas, as terrorist groups. Similarly, with repression and genocide in Xinjiang, 2 or 3 years ago, you would have had a difficult discussion with a lot of people around the world, journalists, policymakers, about whether there was really a genocide happening against Uyghurs in China. Not today. There's consensus on that. It's a reality. Similarly, with Russia's proxy wars and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia's hybrid war, there's no reason for us to be reticent today, or for US policymakers to be reticent about Pakistan's role. And indeed, a US that says it is back in diplomacy, that it is prepared to play a leadership role, to be a catalyst for solutions around the world, will do itself nothing but favors if it tells the truth about what the real strategic situation is between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And let's look at this not in terms of India or Canada or the United States or Europe or any of the partners that are further away from the action. Let's look at this just in terms of Afghanistan and Pakistan. If there is peace between Afghanistan and Pakistan, just a ceasefire, sustained and ultimately permanent, what countries will benefit most from that? Obviously, Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I would argue Pakistan will benefit most because it is a larger country. And its economic influence in Afghanistan will go up immediately, benefiting both countries, changing everyone's perspective about infrastructure for South Asia, the energy network that everyone wants to see benefiting both India and Pakistan. This could be a game changer, and I think it would have a huge impact potentially on relations between India and Pakistan as well down the road. But it has to start with truth-telling. It has to start with calling off, renouncing this principle of positive symmetry that has lingered for too long. And we have to come to grips with the role of a very small minority in Pakistan in sustaining this war. They are self-interested in it. They are benefiting. They do have something to lose, but they are not the only players. And if we're united in putting forward the narrative that we all know to be true about this conflict, about what sustains this conflict, their power will go down quickly. And I think the equation of Pakistani politics can change very quickly as well. We've never seen so many political leaders in Pakistan, not just in PTM, but in PMLN, some in PPP, some in other formations, willing to talk openly about how flawed Pakistan's policy has been in Afghanistan, and indeed towards India more generally. That's a good thing, to have this open rift in Pakistan's establishment. But the MILT establishment is still quite united in continuing down the path to what they hope will be a new pro-Islamabad government in Islamabad. They need to be shown that this time it's not the US and Europe and others that are naive. This time it is they who are naive. And we in Washington, Ottawa, Brussels, Delhi, all around the world who really do believe in peace for Afghanistan, we are the ones who've shed our naivety and are now prepared to tell the truth.
Okay. So thank you so much for that answer. I was thinking of coming back a little closer to your home and asking about Canada's role in Afghanistan. Very few people know that the Canadian forces were involved in Afghanistan, and those started around 2001 and involved from 2006 onwards when the conflict started, and they were redeployed to Kandahar province. But very few people know about Canada's role because it's quite overshadowed by America. Could you just tell a little bit about Canada's role in Afghanistan? Because over 150 uh, soldiers have lost their lives in the war.
Yes. Excuse me. Thanks very much for asking about that. I think there are 3 or 4 key points to make about Canada's involvement. First, we are we did it on a larger scale because of a strategic difference of opinion with the United States. We were one of the principal allies of the US that wanted no part of the invasion of Iraq. And in retrospect, that was a absolutely brilliant decision. I mean, I supported it at the time. I think in retrospect, almost all Canadians realized it was the right thing to do. At the time, it was a bit more divisive because when the US has gone to war, we have tended to be with them. But let me just back up and say that, you know, people in Moscow and elsewhere who say, well, Canada is just an auxiliary, just a yes man for Washington, actually don't understand North American history very well, because we entered both the world wars before the United States and actually played a pretty important role in getting the United States to join us in, you know, after 1914 and 1939. We were together in the UN mandated Korean mission, obviously, but in Vietnam, where countries like Australia and other US allies joined the US effort, we very, very consciously did not. So it wasn't unprecedented for us not to join a US mission, and nor was it unprecedented for us to be involved in heavy combat. So we were not afraid of either. And I think in retrospect, it was the right thing to do, because what did we achieve in Kandahar? We showed that NATO can fight. There hadn't been a NATO land combat operation, you know, above the company level or even the platoon level since the missions in the Balkans. And so this was the first time that NATO battalions and brigades were operating under NATO command, with the US fully part of the operation. And the Taliban got nowhere. You know, they had, when NATO was under force, made some gains in rural areas. But by the time NATO got serious and the US surged, they were essentially pushed out of southern Afghanistan altogether. So the proof of concept for how to end, for what the end of this proxy war looks like, was actually in 2010, 2011, when an initially Canadian effort to deliver hard combat support to Afghan forces in southern Afghanistan became a much larger US and NATO effort. The trouble is that since 2010, 2011, the high water mark of that surge, and then the killing of Osama bin Laden in Abbottabad, the international military footprint in Afghanistan has gone down without any significant political effort to end the proxy war. So what has Canada done besides, you know, taking a lead in 2003 in Afghanistan when most of our allies were going to war in Iraq? We've sustained our engagement with Afghanistan. We delivered most of it through Afghan state institutions, the National Solidarity Program for rural areas, education programming, even constitutional rule of law work were all delivered on an unprecedented scale for Canada through partnerships with Afghan institutions, usually managed by the World Bank. And that was important because we considered it a success in sort of rebuilding an institutional framework that had been almost erased by the Taliban. But a lot of countries also followed our example. We weren't the only ones there in 2003. Germany was there in a very prominent role. But in disarmament, in institution building, in advocating NATO's combat role, Canada played quite an important role. Now, that said, our troops left in 2014. We played a training role after leaving combat, and then our troops left in 2014. So we can understand why the US is doing what it's doing. What most of us who were deeply involved with the Canadian effort can't yet understand is why we're not all talking more openly about the proxy war. But I think that's starting to change. And I think Canada has a special rapport with Afghanistan, not just because there's a big diaspora here, many who came as refugees, many who came as early as the 1970s, but because Afghanistan is a smaller country with a larger neighbor that sometimes has been problematic. I mean, look at Canada. The last two wars we had were invasions by the United States 200 years ago. But if you want to understand Canada, you have to understand that our sovereignty and our success as a country began when the border was agreed and invasions and proxy wars from south of the border ended. So we want the same thing for Afghans. It's very simple. We also understand the challenges they have with diversity, minorities, and indeed two languages. I mean, Afghanistan is not just multi-ethnic and with many Islamic religious traditions represented. It is a bilingual country with additional linguistic minorities, Uzbek, Turkmen, and others. That means you have to approach governing in a very specific way, and I think Indians understand that very well. But Canadians were quite well equipped to deal with this reality, and I think we got it right by being heavily involved in Afghanistan and not being involved in Iraq in the early stages at all. Yep. And let's keep in mind that we can all have our views about U.S. involvement in Iraq. Almost everyone I know understands it was a huge disaster. But there were two disasters. One was to invade in 2003. The other was to cut ties almost completely in 2011 and create the vacuum that was then filled by Daesh and many other extremist groups. And that meant that the U.S. had to go back to Iraq. There's no vacuum in Afghanistan at the moment, but I think Pakistan and others have to understand that the United States is not just a country that leaves when it sees its national strategic interest in withdrawing troops. And indeed, this is something that Biden had promised himself and promised everyone who would listen. He has very particular views on this issue. The United States can also come back when it's in its strategic interest. And I'm not predicting that will happen. But if GHQ's spoiler role continues to be what it has been, that is entirely possible. Moreover, Canada has been a bit of a leader conceptually in dealing with Afghanistan and South Asia. As I say, we gave it priority in 2003. We gave nation building a priority that wasn't popular everywhere, but I think in retrospect it was the right thing to do. We're also one of the few countries that has listed the Taliban as a terrorist group and kept it so listed all through the negotiating period. nothing has changed in the way the Taliban operates in our eyes to merit their removal from the list. If they signed a ceasefire and disarmed and stopped killing civilians on a grand scale, then that discussion would open. But I think we've done three things in Afghanistan. One, make it a focus because the situation really was a threat to international peace and security. And so we were prepared to go into combat to meet that threat. Secondly, we had strong civilian commitment to funding national programs. That continues to this day. And thirdly, we've had some commitment to conceptual clarity. And that includes having listed the Taliban, that includes books written by Canadians on Afghanistan that I think are quite good. And that includes my paper, which I think is one of the only ones to really address this issue of Pakistan's proxy war in a very direct way. And what has struck me about the paper and others who now speak more openly about these issues is that no one challenges those assumptions. No one challenges the arguments and the facts laid out in a paper like that. And other experts could write volumes about the shape of this proxy war and how it worked. I don't think anyone has the strength or the credibility to deny the basic facts of what is continuing the conflict in Afghanistan. And we would do well to all rally around that new conceptual clarity. I would like to see my country do more. I think in recent years, we've stood back a bit. I don't think Canadians have been all that impressed with the US negotiating strategy, and we certainly haven't been directly involved in those negotiations. But there is a Canadian in charge of the UN mission in Afghanistan at the moment, a good friend of mine. So the potential for countries like Canada and others who have a fairly high degree of conceptual clarity to get more involved in the political endgame, I think is very real.
Yeah. So a small follow-up on that before we conclude, Siddhant, as a concluding question. So going from the previous question, I've read the story of Sergeant Grieger, and his story was featured, I remember, on the front page, taken in Kandahar. And there are people like them who have served in Afghanistan, and there are around, as I mentioned, 150 people who have lost their life while serving. So does Canada have a moral obligation to what happens to Afghanistan post-US withdrawal if Taliban comes to power? And if you could also talk about your experience in Afghanistan while you were there a little bit.
Sure. Yes, we have a moral obligation. Canadians have we have lots of challenges at home. Economic challenges coming out of the pandemic, the challenge of abuse in residential schools, and a legacy of genocide and terrible treatment of First Nations and Indigenous people across Canada over a couple of centuries. We need to come to grips with some very fundamental aspects of who we are and overcome some deep injustice that was happening inside Canada. But I think we understand as a trading nation, as a nation of immigrants, that you can only make progress on injustice at home if there is some progress on these larger issues of war, conflict, peace, justice, injustice worldwide. This is the lesson of nonviolent protesters and leaders like Martin Luther King, who one of whose famous quotes, and I'm not going to get it right here, is that if you look away, if you turn away from injustice anywhere, then you are giving scope to injustice everywhere, and the reverse is also true. So we want to remain active in the world, and we want to see peace agreements and peaceful resolution of disputes in as many places as possible, because that's going to make for a world that is in a better position to deal with poverty and inequalities of all kinds, and racism and mistreatment and lack of access to basic services, all the issues we're pursuing under the global goals, as well as climate change and some of the pandemics and some of the more modern challenges we're facing. So while domestically focused, we are internationally active. And whenever Canada's troops have gone abroad, we have fought very hard, not just to win on the battlefield, but to bring about a political result. You know, the US, the two world wars ended with peace treaties that endured and were meaningful for at least decades in the case of the First World War, and in the case of the Second World War for much longer. In Korea, there was an armistice. In the Balkans, where our troops were also in combat, there were peace agreements that brought new countries into being, but helped to stabilize all of Europe. Now our troops are in Latvia, deterring Russian aggression, and in Ukraine, training Ukrainian troops. We hope that helps to bring about a result in which the Baltic states remain NATO members, and Ukraine and eventually Belarus become independent sovereign states, integrating into the EU, into European institutions, and into Euro-Atlantic security institutions down the road. In Afghanistan, that goal hasn't been achieved. But Canadians are stubborn enough that I think we're going to keep speaking up and taking action to make sure that our investment, those lives lost, means something that we can look back and say, not only on behalf of Afghans, but on behalf of our own families and friends of the fallen. Yes, it was a high cost, but there has been a historic achievement here. It took longer than anyone expected, but the achievement is ending a proxy war that went on for 43 years, as well as breaking a cycle of violence that is much deeper. And I talk in the paper about the British Raj and the frontier policy and this 200-year legacy of interference in Afghanistan, which really needs to end. So, yes, I think there is a Canadian commitment to seeing this through, to finishing the job. Yes, I think we have a moral obligation to do so. I think there is more of an audience for what we're talking about today in Canada than there was, say, 5 years ago or even 10 years ago. And I think the international community has a moral obligation to the Afghans and to Afghanistan, because we have allowed them to languish in this position of buffer state for too long. And they paid a very high price in the Cold War to show that Soviet aggression would not be tolerated. The battles didn't happen in Poland or Germany or elsewhere in Europe or North America, as some had feared they might during the Cold War. One of the principal battlefields was Afghanistan itself. And surely, over 30 years after the last Soviet troops left, Afghans have the right to reap some of the benefits of their sacrifice during that war, and their sacrifice in the even more costly civil war that came after. So yes, we have a moral obligation as Canadians, and yes, we have a moral obligation as democracies and states committed to the UN Charter worldwide.
So now that we have discussed almost not everything, but we have touched upon a lot of things and tried to cover the whole spectrum of the war in Afghanistan and across Pakistan. So now that we know there are so many moving bits and parts in the whole theater, so what does the future has for Afghanistan and Afghans in particular? because there is a very strong civil society that has evolved over the years, over the last 2 decades, and so much of liberty is there, so much of rights are there for every section of society, including the minority section as well as the women. So, what are the guarantees for that in future, and what is your personal take as far as the future of Afghans are concerned?
Well, unfortunately, we have to be honest. There's a great deal of uncertainty. The peace process hasn't borne fruit so far, and if one is an Afghan journalist or a merchant in Kabul or a police officer in a lonely outpost in Nimruz province or Baghlan or Daikundi or Paktika, it's going to be, the threat environment is going to be very disturbing for some time to come. We have to think about the uncertainty and the anxiety that Afghans are living with. And I don't think the solutions to this continuing proxy war lie inside Afghanistan. The Afghans will continue to fight. As you say, they will jealously guard the rights women and girls have gained, civil society has gained. I think the gains, to a very significant extent, will remain in all of those areas, but they will be in danger and they will continue to be degraded unless and until there's a mobilization globally of political support for peace in Afghanistan. And here, I think we need to all champion a political escalation, if you will, of interest in the peace process and advocacy on behalf of Afghans to end or to remove the last obstacle to peace, which is Pakistan's proxy war. There's an Afghan diaspora globally that is talking in these terms. There is a peace movement globally that is very outspoken about Putin, very outspoken about Iran, very outspoken about China, that also sees Pakistan's proxy war as a kind of equal or even worse equivalent of those injustices, and all of them need to be opposed. What we need now is we need our political figures in office and out of office, and ultimately governments that are prepared to say more and do more to hold the real authors of this proxy war to account. And I see that starting to happen among my colleagues who served with me in Afghanistan, who are uncomfortable with the failure of the peace process so far and are prepared to talk about the real issue for the first time. We have more work to do to make sure governments are talking about this. I mean, Biden had a very specific agenda. I think others in his administration see things differently. And there are governments, particularly in Europe, that are not prepared to just turn the page on Afghanistan, that think, as we do in Canada, that there's a moral obligation. We need their voices to be louder. And why have they not been louder until now? Well, we've been in a pandemic. I mean, foreign policy has not been at the top of anyone's priority list for more than a year. There's a certain turn towards isolationism, nationalism, populism that has tended to stifle rational discussion of international issues and threats to international peace and security. The dynamic in the UN has changed. There are more dictators throwing their weight around more than ever at the UN. That has made some fora, like the Human Rights Commission and so forth, less not just less amenable, but less available to these kinds of discussion, which have to involve truth telling. But our greatest allies are our voices, and the fact that those of us who are talking about these issues are talking about a reality that isn't going to go away. We just need to show people that, particularly in the US, that focusing on this issue isn't just about Afghans or the legacy of the Cold War or a duty of honor or a moral obligation. It is about U.S. Self-interest. It is about the interest of democracies. It is about the agenda of international peace and security. I would say proxy wars are the biggest threat, live threat to international peace and security in the world today. If we don't take more action politically to stop them, then more unscrupulous leaders, dictators, and others are going to use them as a tool of state policy. And that's not good for India. It's not good for Europe. It's not good for North America. It's not good for any of the major democracies on the planet. So political escalation is what I would like to see, even as we think about the pain, the losses, the anxiety, and the uncertainty that Afghans are living with every day.
So thank you so much, sir, for taking the time on a Sunday morning and speaking to us. It's an honor and a privilege to host you for the session. And I hope more conversation, both in Canada as well as a lot of people from India started speaking about this, about India's engagement post US withdrawal. I hope this continues and we can have more such fruitful conversations in the future.
Thank you so much, both of you. It is a real pleasure to speak to such informed interlocutors. Congratulations on everything you've done with this program and with your advocacy and engagement on these issues. And India has a role of leadership to play in Afghanistan. There is no question. I have no doubt that India will play it. But don't hesitate to engage me and others if you see an opportunity to advance the discussion on this or other issues, because no country can do it alone these days. The Afghans understand that, but I think we all understand that to have success in ending proxy war or removing threats to international peace and security, we need networks, we need alliances of the willing, and we need a lot of cooperation. Cooperation that has been weakened to some extent by the politics of the last 5 years, and certainly by the reality of the pandemic, but which is going to come storming back because of initiatives like yours. So thanks for reaching out, and thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks again for taking the time and being on the show.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much. It was indeed an honor to speak to you in such a capacity. And I believe that we get to have future engagements soon.
Thank you. Stay in touch. All the best.